right, time to get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back if this is your second time coming, and welcome just in general if this is your first webinar. This is of the series, Your Waste to Edible Greens. And I'm Deidre. I am the workshop designer here at Live in Farms. And I'm excited to talk to you today about systems. But first, I just want to encourage participation. So if you do have questions throughout the lesson, please feel free to type them into the chat. I'll take a look at them throughout the presentation. All right, let's get started. So just to begin, as I said, today's lesson will be on systems. We're going to be giving a general overview, and later we're going to be looking how that concept of systems relates to the Hive Explorer 2.0, and I'll be giving you more of a look around our device and just how you would take care of and maintain it. And so let's just begin with sustainability, because that's a pretty big topic that gets thrown around a lot nowadays. And it can be pretty hard to even define it, really. It's quite a general term, and it's pretty complicated and big, and not everyone really knows how to use it. And so if you do look up sustainability, generally what it is it's about being able to do something for a long time, given a very set and restricted amount of resources. During the last webinar, I talked a little bit about our global food system and how that has a lot of problems to it. And so when we talk about making it more sustainable, what we mean is changing the food system so that we're able to feed more people, and as well as the future generations, on the same amount of resources that we still have available to us. Before moving on, I do want to just mention the Live in Farms vision, as it is at the center of our values as an organization. Basically what we want to do is to be able to empower people to co-create lives, and co-create these lives that are both healthy for themselves and then also sustainable for the planet and for the environment. During the first webinar, we did, like I said, we talked about the food systems. And if we're going to talk about shaping and changing our food systems, we need to also consider what does a healthy and a good sustainable food system look like. And that's just something to keep in mind from this point on as I go ahead. Okay, so but before we can actually even think about talking about how to improve the food system, we need to first define what a system is and what a general system is, which is what I have on the slide right here. It's just a very simple version of what a system is. And a system can be broken down into three parts. We have an input, which is what we put in. We have the process, which will change the input. And then we finally have the output, which is what you get as a result. And these inputs and outputs can be considered good or bad. Inputs are generally considered helpful, which is why we want to put them through the system in the first place. And outputs, sometimes they're helpful, which means they can be used again for some other kind of system, some other kind of process. Or they could be unhelpful, and that's often what we would consider waste, because we don't really have further use for it. I just want to take the example of the respiratory system, for example. What we do every day and every time we just need to breathe in. We're breathing in oxygen. Our respiratory system is in our lungs. They're exchanging the gases, and when we breathe out, we get carbon dioxide, and that's the output of that system. And so that's just a very simple example. But I do want to say that when we're calling things helpful and unhelpful, those are very subjective terms, and that's really based on our perspectives. And that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, and although this concept of systems can be quite simple, systems can build on one another. And in reality, most of the systems that we we use and we come across every day are very complicated, especially those that are in the natural world. And we'll talk about more different types of systems, but as we're going through, if you have any ideas of your own examples, if you can think of any examples, please type them into the chat. Okay, so one example of systems building on each other would be like a linear system, which is linear meaning straight, right? You take an input, you eventually have it go through the system, it's processed, you get an output, and then that output can be used as the input for the next system and this next system and so on. And so you get this chain. And if we're talking about an example such as, let's say like paper production, that starts with the trees, which are cut down and then it's processed and eventually get paper. That's just a very simple form of that. When you think about looking at it in more detail, you have the trees which are cut down, they're harvested, the leaves are taken off the branches, and what you get as a result is the lumber, which is the output. You go through the next system, which is the pulp mill process, which takes the pulp from the lumber, and that's the new output. And then that output gets used as the input for the next system, which is the paper mill production, where the pulp is then used to create the paper that we can use for like writing and things like that. That's just one example of a linear system. And another example of systems playing on each other would be a circular system. I mean, both these systems are pretty self-explanatory in terms of the name, but a circular system is just systems interacting with each other in a loop. And so if we think of respiration, and if we're breathing in, we need to breathe in air from somewhere, and we also need to breathe out air from somewhere. And that somewhere we're going to look at is tied to this larger system that is itself circular. So just to explain that a little more, what I have here on the slide is just a person, and as we said, the input is oxygen. He breathes in, there's a gas exchange that happens in the lungs, and then he breathes out, and that's carbon dioxide, that's the output. In this sense, breathing would be a linear system. But the oxygen and the carbon dioxide don't exist in a vacuum, and it has to come from somewhere. And so if we think of like trees, we know that trees are really important for us to be able to live on Earth. The trees will take in carbon dioxide as an input. They'll take it in, and through photosynthesis, they're able to convert that carbon dioxide, and they're able to expel oxygen as an output. And so that's also linear. But when you put these two systems together, you'll see that it creates a circular system. And basically it uses the output from one as the input for the next one, and it kind of feeds it on itself. It goes in a loop. And theoretically, this type of system could run indefinitely because it uses everything. However, as we know just from life, things in reality are much more complicated than that. Okay, and the final type of system I'm going to be introducing today is complex systems. It's really difficult for me to show a diagram of this because, like as the name suggests, these are just systems built on top of each other and interacting with each other in a way that makes a very complicated network. And so you can't just illustrate that in a single diagram. But I did choose this image because there are multiple complex systems happening and that are being captured here. One example would be the hydrologic system, how water circulates through the environment, where from the river, the water is evaporated, goes into the atmosphere, and eventually it condenses and falls down as rain. And then wherever it comes down on the land, it'll start to wash away and it'll come back into the river. Another example would be the geologic system, which has to do with the rocks and the movement of plates and those things through the environment, and it can take the span of several thousands or millions of years. It's much slower. It's a pretty complex system as well. And in nature, a lot of these systems tend to be quite complex, but overall, they do tend to be circular, which brings us to the next point, is that on Earth, everything is contained within the landmass itself and then also the atmosphere around it, which means that everything that's happening there, all the different changes that are happening, are self-contained within our little bubble, our kind of bubble. And that would explain like a lot of the different things that are happening naturally, because they're all occurring on limited sets of resources, and yet Earth is able to sustain life. We're able to have very complex environments, and so a lot of things can happen here, and yet it's all based on limited sets of resources. Now that brings us to artificial systems, because artificial systems, not all of them, but very many of them are built linearly, because they're built on the assumption that we have an unlimited amount of inputs, or at least that the inputs are in such an abundance of supply that it doesn't really matter. We don't really have to worry about the limitations. And that creates a problem, because if you're just going from one end to the other end, you're going to wind up with very few inputs, and you're going to end up with a ton of outputs. And that's exactly what we see nowadays. We're running out of fish in the ocean, and yet we're having tons of plastic in our oceans as well, which is waste. That's just one example. And so as we think about how we're going to improve our systems, it is important to look at natural examples, and then also realize that artificial systems are, and the way that we see them, we don't have to keep them linear. We really can't afford to do that. But it is also within our power to change those systems and reshape those systems to become more like the natural systems that have been operating for billions and billions of years. Okay, what I have here actually is a video. I'm not going to play it just because I do worry about the sound a little bit, but I encourage everyone to take the time to watch. This video basically looks at the history of the Earth and condenses it into 24 hours and how time would be split in that way. Let's see, so if the Earth existed for 24 hours, you would see that we would only really appear on Earth in the last second. And it's important to realize that Earth has been around, or at least it's estimated that it's been around for about 6 billion years, and Earth has been able to support life for about 4.5 billion years. So that's a whole lot of time that Earth has been able to have all these different species and have some sort of life, and yet we only really appeared in the last second, and we're already running into issues of running out of resources and running and just creating a whole bunch of waste. So when we're talking about sustainability, this is all kind of tied in together, and we need to be able to shape our systems so that we can survive, our future generations can survive longer term, especially if we want we want them to have a good future. Okay, so I'm going to break down an example right here of, I'm going to take the example of food waste. Just going to look at that a little bit. And imagine you're living in a neighborhood. The neighborhood is really nice. You go to the supermarket, there's an abundance of food, and there's really frequent trash pickups. And so that's easy. You're living in this nice, beautiful house. Go to the grocery store, you get the food you need, you come home, cook, prepare it, whatever, and then the excess you can just toss in the trash and leave it on the curb. Now imagine that you're not living alone, but you're living with your parents. So there's 3 people in the house now. You're going to be buying more food and you're going to be putting out more waste. And at the moment, it's not a problem because there's a lot of food to be had and there's very frequent pickups by the sanitation workers. But say for some reason or another, you end up having to move neighborhoods and you move to we're going to call it neighborhood B. In this new neighborhood, the groceries are not as quickly stocked. And the trash pickups don't come quite as frequently. And yet you still have the 3 people to feed in your home and you still want to eat at a particular rate and also get rid of your waste at a particular rate. And as you can imagine, eventually over time, you're going to find that you're not able to buy the amount of food that you want just because it's not going to be restocked fast enough. And yet, if the waste is not being picked up super quickly, then you realize that there's going to be an accumulation of waste on the roadside. And eventually, if everyone's running into this problem, the roads are going to get pretty nasty. There's going to be a lot of fresh waste everywhere. There'll be roaches and rats, and you don't even really want to walk out there that often. And so, assuming that things are not going to return to the way that they were, this issue needs to be solved. And you can't just be walking around in such a filthy and smelly place. So if we think about how this happens in nature, like everything will eat, everything will poop and have waste, and yet these kinds of pileups generally don't happen. And the reason that is because there's a system that recycles waste and matter through the environment. And that is a circular system. And so for example, when the mealworms, they'll eat the grain and they'll poop out, and whatever's left over and the poop as well will either be broken down by microorganisms or or the mealworms themselves will be eaten, and those nutrients are later returned to the soil, which can then be used to help other plants grow. So that's all good. That's all circular. But for your own neighborhood, then you need to be able to reshape it so that it kind of resembles that circular system. So let's see, we have an example here. How this food system can be changed, at least this home food system. So imagine you're still buying the same amount of groceries. You're bringing it home. And instead of throwing out the waste, because there is so much waste, you end up keeping it because the waste, if you compost it or you put it into something like a Hive Explorer, you can take the outputs of those things and use it to fertilize plants. You can use it to fertilize vegetables and fruit, and it can help create another source of food for you, so you don't have to rely so heavily on the dwindling supermarket supply. And you can see here that this is much more similar to the circular system I just talked about with matter recycling. And in this sense, you're taking what was originally waste, what was originally an unhelpful output, and changing the way you look at it and realizing that it is actually helpful, and using that within your own system so that it can be fed back, and you're kind of closing the loop on that system. If we're looking at a larger scale beyond just home, what I've added here is just looking at different examples of different countries and the amount of waste that they throw out every year. And also, if that waste was incorporated and used in a way that isn't just thrown into the landfills, they could use it to feed a lot more people. I'm not going to read out everything, you can read it yourself, but in general, we tend to waste about 1/3 of our food. And if we're looking at that, if we extend that beyond ourselves and move to a global scale, we see that we throw out about 1.3 billion tons of food waste a year, which could go on to feed about 2.5 billion people. And since our food systems have the problem of being very polluting to the environment, it's even more of an issue that it's also a huge wasted opportunity to feed people who are very hungry. And I just want to say that I did just look at the UN statistics today, and it showed that there were about 700, an estimated 700 million people who are starving on Earth. So we do actually have enough food on Earth to be able to feed all those people and so that no one is hungry, but we're not using it in a way that is efficient or useful to everyone involved. Okay, due to the interest of time, I'm going to move through this next section a little quickly, but I'm taking another example, and I'm using the example of plastic water bottles, how they're made, they're used once and then we throw them out, and that an inefficient system can be changed to become more circular, and has been done through plastic recycling. And these can be made in, the plastic bottles can be made into things like clothing and bedding and swing sets. And beyond that, the plastic itself you don't have to just use plastic water bottles, but fishing nets have been used to make Jenga tiles. There are companies using wetsuits to make yoga mats, and tires to make, what's it called, the pots for plants. And these are all just doing that same thing where you're taking waste and taking something that is traditionally considered an unhelpful output and thinking of ways to use it and change it so that it can be a more helpful. All right, so what we have now is the tie-in with the Hive Explorer. The Hive Explorer, it was designed as a mealworm farm, as many of you know, and we built it to run on a little electricity and to help with just a tiny bit of input from us to help grow a healthy mealworm colony. And so once we have the device plugged in, we have the heating pad and the fans going. You can see that the device does promote a system in which there's food waste that comes in that we give to the mealworms. There's grains that we give to the mealworms, and we input the electricity into the device itself. And through the natural digestion process of the mealworms, what we get as outputs would be the frass, the live mealworms, some dead mealworms, and also the heat and the fan from electricity, the heat and air circulation from electricity. So I just want you to think whether this system is a natural or an artificial system. You can type in your answer into the chat, but I'll just give you something to think about is that, of course, the device is artificial. That's something our company has made, but the process which the device runs on is the mealworm digestion process, which is natural. So just type in your answers if you want. I'll give that a few seconds. And then we'll just move on to how we kind of thought about this issue. Because yes, this is a trick question actually, because yes, the device is it is a system. It's a linear system actually, because we still have, like I said, we have these inputs and then we have these outputs that are not necessarily being used again in the device. But then how is it sustainable, and why are we as a company even making this device? Well, when we were making it, we really wanted to first understand the mealworms. We wanted to understand how they would survive in the environment and how these waste products that are being generated are used, how these waste products are being used in the environment. And these mealworms, they come from Africa, from the Sahara region in Africa, and they're flour and wheat pests. Now, mealworms are found all over the world at the moment because once the grains and the wheat started to be transported around the world, these mealworms came with them. And now they're continuing to be moved around the world because they make very good meals for a lot of pets, like whether it's birds or fish or even hamsters will eat them. And I already mentioned that the mealworms will eat and the frass will break down in the environment, and it's part of the matter recycling just in the larger environment. It's a circular system. So in our own company, we actually took our cue from nature and we expanded what we considered to be the system itself. And so beyond just the device, we needed to imagine the Hive Explorer as part of a larger system. I'm not going to go through this entire slide because it's kind of complicated. You can take a look at it later. But the Hive Explorer is actually part of a larger, more complex system where it helps to reduce waste. We're using it to educate people, and we're also helping to promote a healthy living. And this expanded system now includes the Hive Explorer, but it also includes us, the employees that live in farms. It includes local restaurants because we will ask them for their fresh food waste. And it also includes the different school communities that are interacting with the hive and that we're using to help teach about sustainable systems. Okay, I'm just going to skip this for now. You can take another look later. We're going to be talking a little bit more about these concepts later in the other webinars. And I just wanted to share with you guys the Hive Explorer, which I have here. We're running out of time a bit, but let's see here. We've got the hive. This is the hive from the office, and I'm just going to show you quickly a little bit about it. We have the air filter up here. What's it called? The top, which is actually when you get it, it will be quite tight. It's good because that actually keeps a lot of the smell and prevents escape. Although the more you use it, the looser it's going to get, which will be good. When you open it, you want to just open this front part first, this front flap, and then using your thumb, you're just going to press up, around, all the way around. Okay, and then it should come up very easily. So we're going to put that to the side first. Your hive, if you do end up getting it, is not going to include this. This is for our own purposes, to tell the temperature and just to check the humidity to make sure they're okay. Plugged in, the fan is over here, and there's a humidity sensor and the temperature sensor right here. And then we have the mealworms. So I'm just going to lift up here, and you can see there's actually quite a few of them. They're just hanging out. They don't love the light, which is why they hang out underneath this tray. And what you need to do with your hive is going to be looking through, and you need to do three main things. You need to clean, separate, and do the feeding. We recommend that order because you can see these mealworms like to poop, especially as they're eating, and you'll be able to collect the frass at the bottom. You just want to take it out every few days just to clean it, and it prevents smell and things from building up in there. This is another picture right here for the beetles and the pupae. And then the next part is going to be the separation. You're going to want to look around to see, there's two pupae right there. And you're going to put them up and put them right here on the pupae level. You want to keep them separated because the mealworms and the beetles are quite voracious eaters, especially the beetles. And while on the other hand, the pupae are resting and they're metamorphosizing. They're not going to eat anything. So sometimes they could be in danger of being eaten themselves. But if you want to learn more about the metamorphosis process, please check out our blog post on our website. Okay, and finally, we're going to have feeding. We have dry food and wet food that we need to feed these guys. The dry food are the oats, which you can see they also like to bury inside of them. So it's always good to have at least a little bit. And the wet food is usually what we would consider part of the food waste. They could include carrots, they could include potatoes. But what I have today is I actually drank some coffee this morning. So we have some coffee grinds. And I'm going to just sprinkle it in there. They like to eat some of that. All right. And then don't forget to put some for the beetles as well. Just a little bit should be okay. All right. And you can just close it up once you've done those 3 steps, and you can leave them be. Awesome. Okay. So we have a few minutes now. I'm just going to stop the screen sharing. Okay, and I see that we have a few comments. All right, so Laura said, it's an artificial system that copies a natural system. It enables our food chain to form a cycled system. Yes, and it's obviously the bigger food chain is going to be a lot more complicated and we'll need a lot more help to get it to become more circular, but in terms of the small scale and with your homes, this is a great start, and it's also a great way to teach other people about these systems. We used to work with another type of insect that was more efficient at eating food, but we do like to use these mostly for educational purposes, and we find that in city living, these guys make a lot more sense in order to help process things in your house. Okay, and so Valeria said, will the coffee grounds be problematic in terms of getting moldy since they're moist, or do you dry them up? I did not dry these coffee grounds up. The difference between whether it gets moldy or not will really depend on the climate that you're in. I'm in Hong Kong and everything is quite humid already. But when you put in any wet food, you do want to check at the end of the day that the mealworms have actually eaten it. And you'll notice right away if they don't like it. And then you can just take it out to prevent any mold from happening and from occurring in there. One day will be fine. Whenever you put anything wet, that is a great point to mention. And yeah, you just have to be mindful of that. All right, we have less than a minute. I'm just gonna say bye really quickly. Thank you so much. I know it's been a bit rushed, but thank you everyone for coming. All right, bye.